An interesting and maybe even a contrarian view on the issue of supply chain visibility in my conversation today with Krenar Komoni. He is founder and CEO of Tive. Krenar, welcome back.
Great to see you.
Always good to have you with us. What is the most interesting trend that you are seeing right now as it relates to supply chain visibility?
The trend that we're seeing that's quite interesting, a little bit of a surprise to me especially, because I thought that this trend was not going to happen, is that around compliance of supply chain visibility. So what we see in largest CPG companies in the world, largest beverage companies in the world, what they realized is they've pulled all this data around telematics from trucks, ELDs, information around where the shipments are, and they're compliant maybe around 30 to 40%. So they don't know where 2/3 of their shipments are in real time.
How is that even possible? I mean, we think that the technology is supposed to virtually ensure 100% pinpoint tracking capabilities, and yet why are they falling so short?
It does. For the 30%, it does, right?
Well, okay.
But why for
but
the
we're
rest?
talking the 70%. Why the failure there?
It has to do with two things, and one of them has to do with carrier fragmentation. There's a lot of trucking companies, close to 500,000 or more trucking companies in the United States alone. There's more than 100,000 companies, trucking companies in Europe, and onboarding those carriers has been a challenge, especially pulling the data from all of them. And the second reason behind that challenge, and the reason why we're only seeing 1/3 of their shipments, has to do with the incentives for the carrier. So carrier knows that the shipper needs them. Carrier knows that the truck needs to still gonna show up there and pick up the load, but doesn't have the incentive to actually share that data and be on time to provide that data to the end consumer.
Okay, well let's take the first point. You say that there are so many hundreds of thousands and however many carriers out there, and yet we could apply the 80-20 or the 90-10 or the 95-5 rule and say that the preponderance of those carriers, I mean most of the freight is being carried by a smaller number of big carriers, right?
Right.
So a lot of those huge numbers of carriers you're talking about are essentially very small. So would you say that the larger carriers are doing better on compliance than the smaller ones, or are they having problems as well?
The larger carriers are definitely doing better, especially the ones that are own all their assets. But if you think of a large 3PL who potentially doesn't own their assets, they still have to subcontract to many other carriers.
Yeah.
So they're trying to be compliant for their customer, but they still can't.
Okay, on the incentive side, I guess that holds true especially when capacity is difficult
Limited.
to come
Yes,
by.
yes.
In a carrier's market, they can behave that way, but when it goes the other way, then I guess suddenly they have an incentive to do a better job, right?
True, that could definitely happen. However, that trend we haven't seen that much, right? Because the truckers, there's always shortage of truckers, there's shortage of supply out there, so carriers know that they need to provide the service. However, they're not incentivized to share data. For instance, my father-in-law has a trucking company, and one of his drivers doesn't want to install the app.
Just because he doesn't want to.
He just doesn't want to be tracked for whatever reason.
Okay.
And if you think of it that way, what's the incentive of a father-in-law firing him? He can fire him, but how do you find the next truck driver when there's so much shortage?
Right. How do you see the evolution of customer needs changing around the issue of visibility?
I look at that as, think of the evolution of overall supply chain visibility and how that happened. In the beginning, customers didn't know where anything was. I would say maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago. And then the next trend, the first generation around visibility was, okay, I know now that the shipment left the warehouse, it arrived at a port, left a port, it arrived at a distribution center. So that was the next phase around visibility. The next second generation was, okay, let's figure out where the assets that are actually moving the goods, where those assets are, the trucks, the airplanes, the vessels. And we hit a barrier there with compliance, as you can see. I think it's going to get better over time, but we'll never get to 100% compliance and visibility. And the next trend that we're seeing, this third generation of supply chain visibility, is going on the actual, getting visibility on the actual load, on the goods that the shipper is shipping.
So we get to the point where you're tracking what's in the trailer, not just the trailer itself.
Yes.
Yeah. So what kind of technological improvements and advances do you see coming up that are happening to support this evolution toward increased compliance and increased visibility?
Very good question, and I would like to answer that maybe with an analogy. Think of what happened to the cable companies. Back in the day, the way to watch content was through cable TV. And what happened is we realized there's these sticks now, HDMI sticks that go on behind your TV, whether it's Google Chromecast, Amazon Fire TV stick, and you just plug those in, and you get to see the content. You get to go to Netflix, Amazon Prime, and you get to see the videos, and you're skipping the cable companies. And what shippers are realizing is that they could probably do the same thing on shipments too, and visibility. Is instead of relying on telematics data, instead of relying on from the actual assets that are moving the goods, instead of relying on whether a truck driver installed a smartphone app or not, they could put sensors on the goods and just get that data directly from their load, from their goods, regardless of mode of transportation and regardless of who's driving that load.
You know, we throw around this word disruption to mean anything we want it to mean, but boy, this sounds like that really is disruption.
Definitely.
That you really are cutting out a burgeoning industry of telematics suddenly finds itself being circumvented by these devices and these sensors, right?
Correct.
Yeah, how interesting. Well, Krenar, thank you so much for helping us to understand very surprising revelations in the world of supply chain visibility, and of course we can only hope that this compliance issue becomes better as the years go by, but thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Bob. I was surprised too, but thank you for the invitation and for the interview.
Great, thanks. I've been speaking with Krenar Komoni of Tive. Thank you very much for watching.